Hello, my name is Andy Clark. I'm a PhD candidate at the University at Albany SUNY in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice. I'm also a teacher in a K-12 school district in Western Massachusetts. My research is on the predictive relationship between comprehension and production of formulaic language and English language learners. Let's dive right into it. How would you complete this sentence? Would you say she learned coding pretty quickly, or would you say she picked up coding pretty quickly? If you chose picked up coding pretty quickly, chances are you're a native or native-like speaker of English. Now, picked up is an interesting expression because it has 5 distinct meanings, only one of which is literal. So that's really challenging to second language learners because unlike generative grammar, formulaic expressions like situation-bound utterances, collocations, and phrasal verbs are retrieved as whole units, and that makes them really challenging for ELLs and a marker of linguistic and cultural competency because the meaning associated with the phrasal verb is not made up of the individual lexical units, right? So my research really looks at the differences between production and comprehension of this linguistic feature. Now, let's talk a little bit more about what phrasal verbs are. Phrasal verbs, according to Oxford, are a verb combined with an adverb or a preposition, or sometimes both, to give new meaning, to which I would add is often unrelated to the meanings of the lexical components that it is comprised of. So let's look at an example of a phrasal verb. Put down. Put down is ranked number 58 out of a whole bunch of frequently used phrasal verbs. And across corpora, we've seen it occur over 7,000 times, which is a lot. Now, put down, just like pick up, has only one literal physical meaning. The rest of its meanings and associated contexts are abstract and non-literal. Now, phrasal verbs are, like I said, a category of formulaic language, and it's crucial for native-like proficiency. However, phrasal verbs are really tricky because they have many meanings and are made of high-frequency vocabulary. So they're also common across registers, not only used in casual conversation, but in medicine, sports, science, business, and any other field where English is used. Now, why is it important that we focus on something like phrasal verbs? Forgive me for taking a step back to define language as I see it through a theoretical lens. Now, first of all, what is language? Well, it's a big question. According to Istvan Keskes, language is a system of signs operated by a conceptual base, which is a reflection of the sociocultural background in which the system of signs is put to use. Pause the video and consider this one. Apply it to your first or second or third language. It's worth it. Okay. Now, let's put this into context. Imagine an American who speaks American English. They're going to rely on their American conceptual base, which is their mental framework. And this is influenced and constrained by their sociocultural background and also the experiences that they've had that are typical of an American using American English. Now, essentially, Americans communicate in English based on their unique cultural and social experiences, and that's all grounded in that shared American experience. So when you have two Americans in the room, they speak freely with each other using preferred, prefabricated ways of describing the world around them. Check this out. Any chance you can pick up the check? Well, this has become a situation-bound utterance with a new implied meaning, which is to pay for. Pick up means to pay for. Now, if the person doesn't have any money, they might respond with I wouldn't count on it. And wouldn't count on it means to have zero faith in something. So again, we've used a phrasal verb to make a meaning that doesn't equate with the lexical units that it's comprised of. However, because this is the preferred way of doing it, native speakers use phrasal verbs all the time, and they understand them contextually. But what about in intercultural communication? which is, native to non-native communication. Well, we've still got our American who speaks American English, but imagine that they're communicating with a Japanese person who's speaking English. That Japanese person is going to use their conceptual base and their sociocultural background to inform how they use English. So it might look something like this. Where did you learn Japanese? This is ad hoc generative language construction. They're relying on the lexical units to create meaning, whereas an American is going to say something like, I picked it up when I lived in Nagoya. Again, we see two phrasal verbs being used. Okay, and this is all prefabricated language, right? There's a strong reliance on using prefabricated language by native speakers and lexical ad hoc language by non-native speakers. So there must be a plethora of studies that also evidence this kind of phenomenon. And there are. Formulaic language research in pragmatics goes all the way back to 1985 and further if we think about Grice. But, Krashen really talks about how language is acquired naturally through direct exposure, right? Meaningful input. And that's super important because, second language learners typically avoid phrasal verbs, even though they understand them. And so what that suggests is that input alone isn't sufficient. Now, Swain counters this by proposing an output hypothesis, saying that we need to produce language to help us internalize it, right? Keskes says that, yeah, we can do all of those things, but we still, as second language learners, are going to rely heavily on our first language conceptual base. So we're going to avoid native-like usage of the target language. And Bardovi-Harlig found that increased exposure might improve EL's ability to produce culturally and pragmatically appropriate language. But there are other factors here, right? There's cognitive and social factors that also play a role, such as age, proficiency, and cognitive style. Moreover, there's different models showing how we process language based on different frequencies and L1 influences. Moreover, corpus linguistics is showing us how important this kind of research is because this is a massive part of the English language. And so we need to develop interventions and strategies to help second language learners identify and deal with these challenges, or second language learner teachers and administrators and policymakers deal with these challenges. But, there's more to it than even this. There's also a role of output, because we know that the more output we get, the more formulaic language and expression we'll find in speech and writing. But that creates additional challenges because there's a lot of avoidance of phrasal verbs in formulaic language, often being replaced with single word synonyms or just literal lexical translations from the first language. And there is also a significant correlation between, our phrasal verb comprehension and our written production. But there's also, some research lacking in that field as well. However, there have been some studies that looked at comprehension as a predictor of production. So we know that comprehensible input plays a critical role in production. And stronger comprehension skills lead to more accurate syntax and morphology usage. And that higher comprehension scores also predict better performance in assessments in different types of tasks. So that reinforces a comprehension production connection. But let's examine this just a little step further and allow me to introduce my research questions. So I want to see in this study if there's a relationship between production comprehension and language level in a full sample and an EL sample alone. So my full sample is native speaker and non-native speakers combined. I also want to look at, comprehension of phrasal verbs and language level's ability to predict production outcomes of phrasal verbs in a full and ELL only sample based on a novel test that I wrote. that focuses only on phrasal and lexical verbs. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about how comprehension contributes uniquely to an ELL only model, and also how English level and comprehension uniquely contribute to the same model. So this looks at things through a nested models regression lens. To answer these questions, I collected data using Qualtrics from a novel test that I wrote. Data analysis was conducted using a combination of SPSS and RStudio. All of my tests were conducted using alpha 0.05, two-tailed hypothesis testing. If you want more information on my statistics, please feel free to reach out. I would love to go over all of the math with you. Okay, let's get into the first test. So before the first test, let's look at a sample survey item. So this first one is a multiple choice question, and it was designed to elicit really just one correct answer, which was the phrasal verb. He blank when the waiter forgot his order. We're looking for blew up. Exploded would also be acceptable. Mad and turned off would show that there's some kind of grammar disconnect, and either the context isn't understood or the student or participant is only choosing the lexical verb. Now, those three things would be more indicative of a second language learner. However, if the participant chose blew up, that would show that they comprehended the context and were able to complete the sentence with a culturally and pragmatically appropriate phrasal verb, indicating first language or near native level. Okay, now my second question type was a production question type. In this question type, I presented participants with a context and asked them to fill in the blank. So there was complete freedom whether to use a lexical or a phrasal verb. I want to make sure that everyone understands that priming occurred throughout my assessment, with phrasal verbs being introduced in the comprehension section before the free production task was introduced. So a young man gave up his seat to an old lady on the bus today. Gave up would have been previously introduced in a comprehension-based survey item. Okay, so in addition, there was a collection of literal and non-literal examples of usage, and to make sure that the test was robust, it was tested on a group of adult native and non-native speakers, many of whom were linguists and educators, all of whom were bilinguals. I do believe there are still some limitations to my test design, and I'll address that later at the end of the study. Anyway, let's look at the demographics. I was able to recruit a total of 48 students, 24 of which were ELs and 24 of which were native speakers. The students attended a nationally accredited independent school in Connecticut in grades 5 through 9. The participants were aged 10 to 15 with an average age of about 13. Gender demographics were equal, although asymmetrically split between the two groups. 15 male and 9 female students in the native speaker group and 15 female and 9 male students in the EL group. Participants self-reported their English proficiency, with native speakers reporting level 4 and non-native speakers reporting a scale of 0 to 3. Let's look at the first test. This is a correlation test of production, comprehension, and language level in the full NTEL sample. Just looking here at the scatter plot, I think that we can see a pretty clear, strong positive relationship between production, comprehension, and English language level. I also see a few outliers that could be potentially influencing or impacting or leveraging the results. Let's look at the EL sample. The EL sample looks pretty similar. We see a fairly strong positive relationship between the variables. All right, now let's take a look at the summary statistics. I found strong connections between comprehension, production, and proficiency in the full sample. Production and comprehension are highly correlated, 0.63, with a p-value less than 0.001. Production and proficiency are also strongly linked. at 0.58 with a p-value, again, of less than 0.001. This tells me that, in general, the more proficient a learner is, the better their comprehension, and the better they can produce language, especially phrasal verbs. Now, in the EL group, the relationships are still positive, but slightly weaker. Production and comprehension drop to row 0.57, which is still statistically significant at the 0.004 mark. So that does meet my criteria of 0.05. Production and proficiency also sit at around 0.57. However, comprehension and proficiency are even more tightly connected at 0.65. Again, with a p-score of less than 0.001, so indicating statistical significance. So what does it mean? Well, in the full sample, everything sort of moves together. Proficiency, comprehension, production, all rise in sync. But for second language learners, comprehension and proficiency are strongly linked, but production isn't as tightly connected. So this suggests that while they understand more as their proficiency improves, it doesn't always translate directly to stronger production. So this highlights a key takeaway. ELLs may need more explicit instruction or structured practice to turn comprehension into fluent production. So understanding alone might not be enough. They need more opportunities to actively engage and produce language in meaningful ways. Now, let's take a look at a multiple linear regression of the full and EL samples. I'm looking at production as my predictive, as my dependent variable, and comprehension and English level as my predictors. So in looking at this heat map of the full sample, again, it kind of tells us the same thing. As comprehension and English proficiency increase, we can see a higher expected production score. And the same can be said of our EL sample, although the distribution looks a little bit tighter. Again, and that could have a lot to do with some of the outliers that we saw in the scatter plots earlier. But let's examine the results through a predicted versus observed scatter plot. Again, the model fits pretty well. We see some, outliers that could be influencing things, but it looks pretty good. In the EL sample, it looks pretty similar, although we do see some outliers that are definitely impacting the results. Excuse me. Let's look at the summary statistics. So again, I looked at how comprehension and English proficiency impact production. In the full sample, the model explains about 46% of the variation in production scores, which is a pretty strong relationship. The overall model was highly significant, meaning at least one of these predictors was doing some real work in explaining production differences. When I break it down, both English and comprehension were significant predictors. So for every 1 unit increase in comprehension, production increased by about 0.6 points. And for every 1 step increase in English level, production rose by roughly 1.2 points. And this confirms what I expected. Higher comprehension and higher proficiency tend to lead to better production scores. But things got more interesting when I looked at the EL group. The model still explained a good chunk of variance, about 39%, and it was statistically significant. But unlike the full sample, neither comprehension nor English level individually reached significance levels. And this suggests that there may be some kind of multicollinearity at play. And we kind of assumed that based on some of the outliers we were looking at. But what that means is that 2 of these predictors are overlapping in what they explain, or that I just don't have enough variability in this small sample to actually detect the clear effects. So here's my takeaway from this, right? The full sample, comprehension and proficiency, are solid predictors of production. But in ELs, the relationship isn't always as straightforward, which means that I need to dig a little bit deeper, maybe testing for interaction effects or running a nested model to consider how other factors like exposure could play a role in determining how well we can predict production. So let's look at a nested model where I look at the unique contribution that comprehension makes versus the unique contribution that proficiency level makes in this model. So when I ran the nested model analysis to determine whether adding English as a predictor improved the ability to explain production scores beyond comprehension alone, the results show some interesting differences between the restricted model, which only includes comprehension, and the full model, which included both comprehension and English level. So in the restricted model, where production was predicted only by comprehension, the model explained about 32% of the variance in production. R squared is 0.323. And this was statistically significant. And you can see that the F score, the F stat of 10.481 has a very low p-value of 0.004, right? Comprehension was a strong predictor with a coefficient of 0.745, and again, this 0.004 p-value suggests that as comprehension increases, production also increases significantly. However, in the full model where English level was added, the R squared increased to 0.390, meaning that the combination of both predictors explained about 39% of the variance in production. While this suggests a slight improvement in the model's explanatory power, the F-change test was not strongly significant. More importantly, in the full model, neither comprehension nor English level remain statistically significant, suggesting that multicollinearity is having a real role in between these two predictors. So what does this mean? Well, while comprehension alone was a significant predictor in the restricted model, adding English level caused its effect to diminish, right? Likely due to this overlapping variance between the two variables. This suggests that English level and comprehension may not contribute uniquely to predicting production, and further analysis, such as testing for interaction effects or using alternative modeling approaches, may be needed to clarify their roles, such as principal components analysis or mediation or moderation of other variables on these target variables. So, what does that all mean? Well, my findings confirm that comprehension and proficiency play a crucial role in the production of phrasal verbs. In my full sample, I found a strong positive correlation between comprehension, production, and proficiency. These results were statistically significant, showing that the more proficient a learner is, the better their comprehension and production scores. Now, my regression model further supported this, showing that comprehension significantly predicts production, explaining about 32% of the variance in production scores. My overall model was statistically significant, and it reinforced the idea that comprehension is a key factor in predicting production. However, when I looked specifically at my ELL sample, the model became statistically non-significant. This suggests a possible issue with multicollinearity, where comprehension and English level are explaining an overlapping variance, making it really difficult for me to separate their unique contributions. So to further investigate that, I ran a nested model to see if comprehension and proficiency contribute uniquely to production. And while both models were statistically significant, once English level was included, its predictive power became non-significant. This suggests that proficiency may not add much explanatory value beyond comprehension alone, at least based on my data. And it's important to point out these limitations of my data, and that I have a very small sample size. I'd really like to increase the sample size so that I can detect more effects on my test. I'd also like to develop my data collection instrument a little more and adapt and develop some of the test questions to make my data much richer and robust. And I think that one of the ways that I can do that is, rather than asking for an arbitrary self-reported proficiency, to request standardized test scores and then use a model to make all of those different test scores relate to my own. So the main thing here is that there are important implications based on these findings. Comprehension is clearly a critical factor in production, and that means language instruction should focus on developing strong comprehension skills early on, not just in lexical verbs, but in formulaic language, importantly. So what I mean by this is that rather than sticking to teaching beginner and early, low intermediate students lexical language, we should also be focusing on introducing them to as much formulaic, prefabricated language as possible, thereby not only expanding their lexicon, but developing their ability to access formulaic language as single unit chunks rather than looking at each individual lexical unit as its contribution to the whole. I think that if we consider that as educators, policymakers, and material developers, moving forward, we can address some of these differences between comprehension and production of formulaic language between native and near native-like speakers and early, intermediate, and advanced, low advanced language learners, because ultimately we want to try and increase all of our students' proficiency scores, whether it be in comprehension or production. But if we only focus on one type of language, lexical languaging, and ad hoc generative grammar, then we're missing out on getting our students the really good stuff that we find in the speech community, especially when our students want to become parts of that targeted speech community. Moving forward, I plan to address some of the limitations that I found in my test. I'd like to state that there was no funding received by myself to conduct these tests, and I hope that you found this presentation both informative and entertaining. Thank you very much for your attention. Go seichou arigatou gozaimashita. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at Andy Clark, AHCLARK @albany.edu. Thank you very much.